We're going to go, I think, straight to Lewis in Shetland, just to get what's your kind of insights, thoughts, and feelings from that, from what you've just heard. So, what do you think, Lewis?
Well, two massive questions, and I was very lucky enough to be at the gathering in person for both of them, so being able to get a wee sense of both. But I think some of the key themes for me around, one, how connected these policy areas are in terms of the well-being economy and the climate change. And I think there's much more work that we can be doing to think about how we tie up that and with some of these wider things that are happening across Scottish Government in terms of the Human Rights Bill, for example. I think a big one is how we reimagine funding. And I think that's come up in a few other conversations, including earlier this morning. Recognizing, I really was taken by what Helen was talking about in terms of upstream, preventing harm rather than just thinking about mitigating it as well. And then I think for me, the last bit is around how do we bring this story in. And there's a great, Taliette talked a lot about, the storytelling that we do and how we go beyond those, beyond perhaps the converted and the most privileged, and recognizing that how difficult things are for many communities, and how do we have these conversations that can reimagine, the economy around well-being, or talk about climate change in ways that are not this deficit type, approach of changing, but reimagining what is possible with communities in ways that are creative and dynamic and tell much more interesting stories rather than positive stories.
Thank you very much, Manish. How about you? What's your take on that? What's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think the challenges before us are huge, right? In terms of where we need to go around, climate change, redefining our economy, sustainability. And I don't think we are lacking any of the resources or tools to do any of that work. We have, we've got a plethora of reports and strategies in Scotland to do it. I think some of it is around political will. I think a lot of it is around money and financing and moving that money to get it to the right places. But I think the other piece is actually just about more collaboration. So how can we come together more to tackle some of these, wicked problems? We can't do them on our own. We can't do them in silos. I think to Lewis's point around intersectionality, you can't just tackle climate change in and of itself, because it is interconnected with so many other issues. So I think, the challenge before us, I think, as a sector, is how can we work better together, to use the resources that we've got.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the collaboration was a key point that came out in both of those sessions. I think that was really loud and clear from you. So Lewis, what's kind of any more thoughts on that with what Manish was talking about there?
Definitely. I think it works on all the different levels. So, if we want to work in communities, and we do a lot of community work on the ground, as it were, it's all about relationships. It's about building relationships, building levels of trust, building, and going at the pace of trust, as a classic, and how it's about thinking about how that takes time. And I think that also scales up to the level of the kind of practitioner and of organizations. And it also takes time to do that. And a lot of our work is around building networks. We have a cultural wellbeing network, we have a youth work and STEM network, and we have a community research network as well. And they all work across sectors, and every sector has different languages in terms of how they come across things, and different set points and different drivers. And so all that requires time and capacity to pull together. And I think we can acknowledge that now more than ever, both in terms of the cost of living crisis, but also the cost of running crisis, capacity, is at a real all-time low. And I think it's really relatively fair to say. And whilst it is great that from a policy perspective, there's more and more appreciation of things like co-production, co-development, co-design. I think the paradox is actually that takes more time, not less. And I think there's this open question about how do we build in these systems and processes that acknowledge that, and don't just assume that, we're going to co-design and co-produce it when especially the trust hasn't been built, and actually allow that time to develop. And again, for me, that's thinking about these kind of funding systems that are built on trust, and allow that time rather than saying, here's the money, deliver it within 3 months, because that just can't work.
And Lewis, are you seeing anyone who's doing that innovative piece around funding? Because I think we're still working off very traditional models, aren't we? And the power dynamic in terms of that funder-fundee relationship. Are you seeing anyone who's doing it differently?
I think there's some really interesting work in this space around participatory grant making. I mean, one of the small things that I mentioned we were doing a little bit before is trying to reimagine research funding. So traditionally, research funding goes directly to the university and to the researchers. And of course, there's very much a place for that. But what we're trying to do is give that money directly to the communities who are most affected by climate change or mental well-being to still very much work in partnership, but change the power dynamics around that. And I think we help deliver that through the Ideas Fund and the High Designers Climate Change Grant. And thinking through the whole process is very, I think one of the key learnings that we have is not just about the money, especially if we are working with communities who are on the sharp ends of disadvantage, who are underrepresented and marginalized. It's about all the wraparound support and capacity building and trust building that is required to enable this to happen and to build systems and processes and capacity so that even when the funding is finished, they're in a stronger place to where they are now, where I think, very often there's a feeling that funding, and the processes and being very rigid and setting out what you're meant to do or the outcomes that you're meant to have achieved, even if it's all about relationship building, for example, it can really be actually more problematic and damaging and actually set communities up to fail. So I think we really need to learn from those lessons. And one of the things we're really keen on is take some of the learning that we've had from our experience so far and talk to the other funders and be really open about what's worked, what's not worked, and how we can build from there.
No, that sounds really interesting. And I think, if other people, I guess, even in the chat today have got examples of different funding models, we'd love to hear about that, because it's the kind of thing we could even pull together a bit more and help people resource, I guess, around that, because it's definitely a changing space, but I'm not sure the pace of change is keeping up with where the challenge is.
And you were asking Anna earlier around Anna. For those of you who might have missed it, our chief exec at SCVO was talking about she has a catch up with international people who are in her similar positions across the world. And you were asking her if she was seeing different funding models worldwide. And the answer was no. There isn't really.
And I think, we've obviously got an interesting session coming up later on today with Lan Kelly Chase, who, from a philanthropic perspective, are taking a very different approach. And I think trying to celebrate those examples more and try and encourage, I guess, bigger philanthropy to think about how they might give away their endowments or how they might make it easier. And I think for small grassroots groups, that's one of the biggest challenges, isn't it? Because it's so much time is spent on reporting when actually we talk about 75% of people don't have staff and are it's volunteers that are doing this work. That becomes really onerous on people around both like writing grant applications and reporting on grant applications, where actually what we need is just money on the ground so people can make change.
I think as well, this is back to that, the idea around the well-being was there. I think it's Lily Renaud, Jean Renaud, who says, as a generation, they are exhausted and this needs to happen now because everybody's tired. And this is the new generation who are coming in and they're already exhausted. They're already knackered. So it's not looking bright. So what can we do now? And there was a call to action around collaboration, I think, but what's your thoughts, Lewis? What can we do, Lewis? What can we do?
It's a $1 million question, really. I think a quote that comes to mind for that is the work of Naomi Klein, the climate activist, and she talks a lot about how, it's okay for us to make mistakes, but we have to make new mistakes. And I think, to me, I really take that because we don't, the climate crisis is upon us. The economy is really, people are really at the sharp end of it. And so I think for me, that quote is powerful, not just in terms of that kind of enabling element of it, but also thinking about our appetite for risk. I think when we talk about more kind of grant making that's based on trust, is based on a relational approach, which doesn't necessarily know all the outcomes and can tie everything up because it doesn't want to put the pressure on communities to kind of, and that's not how good community engagement and development works. It should be emergent and it should be developed with the people who are most affected. And so I think for us, there's a wider conversation about risk and how we can tolerate risk and I think for that is about, like Manish, what you're saying, there's a lot of evidence out there, there's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of that. And actually we do have a bit of a public sector, which sadly is built on fear. It is built on, all these processes are built around accountability, but actually make things less safe and much, much less accountable because we're counting every penny, but not actually counting the relationships, the things that are intangible. And so that is a difficult question. And to be honest, that is something that I think we need to be collectively need to campaign a little bit more against, because actually sometimes the systems ask for these things, and it's because we also sometimes criticize, in terms of when things don't go right, but actually some things have to not go right for us to be able to do the ambitious work. It's that kind of classic thing of like, if it's all very safe, then you're probably not actually making the scale of change that we need to see. And I think there's something we just need to be a lot more ambitious and bold about pushing back when it is right to push back, and not just playing the game. And I think that's something that, I mentioned our kind of wider advocacy network, Community Knowledge Matters, is trying to do, is around community evidence, community, expertise, community-led research. Yes, on some levels, but how do we get that into the hands of policymakers to change these systems? But also, how do we collectively, push back and actually change the way that policymakers accept evidence and risk as well? And it's not just about us changing, it's about how we change them. And
Lewis, I get the sense from you that you're actually quite an optimistic individual, and you so like how's your own, I guess, personal resilience through this? Because you're dealing with some really challenging issues. So what do you do, I guess, to kind of navigate these spaces?
I think that's a great question. I think the first thing for me is an organization called Science Kaylee. My background is in neuroscience research, but also in social music, and so and fiddle. And so for me, we very much embed culture and creativity and joy in the work that we do, whether that is, as practitioners working with people living with dementia or young people, but also even when we think about the more, kind of thought leadership, the kind of the work, the more strategic work in the sector, I think we need to think about how we build culture and creativity, because that's also that's what people relate to, even when we're thinking more strategic systems level work. And so I think that's my first response, is how we find these small pockets of joy and creativity, and not taking, this respite from the seriousness of the work. And and I think there's something about how, I heard recently, it's not about necessarily being optimistic or pessimistic, but knowing that this work is worth doing, even though we don't necessarily know what the outcome's going to be. And I take respite in that.
No, that's really, really positive to hear. And I think you've talked a few times about the importance of the arts and culture. And what more do you think we could be doing as a sector to, I guess, promote art and culture through all the work we do? Because I think sometimes, you talked about your STEM network, but I guess you could talk about STEAM networks, where actually bringing arts and culture and creativity. Is there anything you think we as a sector could be doing more of to promote creativity and artistic culture?
Very much so. Yeah, we in fact, we've got a whole policy document about how third sector can work much more closely with the culture sector, and recognizing the important spaces of places like libraries, for example, which very much bridge that kind of role, especially, we've seen over the cost of living crisis. I think the small ways, it's just thinking in small ways about how you bring your own interest and creativity within the work. You collaborate with artists and local cultural organizations, because very often they're very willing to support that, I think. And there is also that intrinsic value of culture, and I think that's going to come to the fore. We think about kind of things like the Human Rights Bill, that was already mentioned in the conversation around climate. We need safe, environments, but also there is a human rights approach to think about culture. We all have the human rights within the declaration around, to be able to participate in culture and to benefit from science and research and technology. And so I think there's something about how we can be better at recognizing that as part of the package that the third sector and the kind of wider support can do. And plus it's enjoyable. It brings in joy. So
yeah, it's a shame we don't have time for you to play your fiddle for us today, because it'd be nice to have had some musical interlude.
Next time.
I just got a final thought just around modelling this behaviour. So obviously, as you were saying, Lewis is coming across as an optimistic person. I'm always, forever optimistic. So that about modelling how we take this forward. So as leaders or as people who are working in this sector, what's the phrase? Be the change you want to see in the world. Exactly. Yes. So doing that and actually saying, we are behaving how we want this to move forward. And I think that sounds quite what you're talking about, Lewis, is that actually let's get out there, let's do it. Let's make this difference, I think, from what you were saying. Yep.
Yeah, very much so. These are big issues. I think it's what's within your sphere of, of influence, and how do you push back where you need to push back and hold where you need to hold, and drive things forward where you've got the power to drive things forward. So, this is what the third sector is made of. But I think we need to just be bolder and braver about that, and more creative.